So, with the latest events of the My Hero Academia story, after months of intrigue and action, it seems as though our war of heroes versus villains is now finally approaching its climax, at least for the time being. And this is something I have a whole lot of feelings towards, as at one point, a whole lot of fans questioned what could possibly follow an event such as this. I mean, in the case of plenty other series, war is the final frontier, the climactic end to something built up over several arcs. However, it should now be clear to the vast majority of us that there is just so much more to explore beyond this. Now, the war arc has been spectacular and mind-blowing on many levels, but something that truly blew me away was the fact that our Greek mythology mega theory was so damn accurate. Like I always say, Plot Armor has some of the best My Hero Academia content on the platform, and that video is a perfect example of this. It's something you're not gonna find anywhere else and is to date, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest My Hero theory video on YouTube. Now, this was a video made prior to the war even starting at pretty much the beginning of 2020. Yet here we are in December with it still being proven correct in more ways than one. But with such a long time having elapsed since its creation, I figure it could be pretty fun to consider everything that has come to fruition while also adding a bit more speculation into the mix based on some newfound context. And if you haven't yet seen that one, I cannot recommend it enough. It is sitting at nearly 500,000 views at this point and gives some necessary context to this whole discussion. But anyways, to begin with, we liken the presence of my boy Kirishima to that of Hercules, or Heracles, strongest of the mortals. It was prophesied that he would be integral to the defeat of the giants, and so we claimed that Kirishima would be vital to taking Gigantomachia down. And what we received was Kirishima pushing Mina out of harm's way after sprinting through a blazing inferno of trees, only to then scale the hulking arm of Gigantomachia, all the while proclaiming his name to be that of Red Riot, a hero that does not allow those behind him to bleed, as he then chucked Momo's sedative right into the monster's mouth. An act that several chapters later has now toppled the giant and provided the heroes a chance at victory. Past this, we also proclaimed that Shigaraki and Deku would now finally face one another in combat, as they represented Typhon and Zeus respectfully, with a fight that would not bode well for Deku, as he would be severely outmatched. But with this, My Hero Academia is of course a shonen story, and so in this case, this disadvantage was very much offset by the assistance of various heroes on the scene. But even still, we said that as Zeus, Deku would have his tendons cut. And as we now can see, Deku cannot use his arms or his legs. But we furthermore described this loss to be quirk related as well, something that Deku narrowly managed to avoid happening within the world of One for All. And this prediction, mind you, was prior to our collective understanding that Shigaraki would receive All for One at all. Something that, to be fair, we did properly theorize a few days later in a preceding video. But getting back to Greek mythology, we liken the female presence of the story to be that of Athena. Now, as I said previously, it is certainly unfortunate that the ladies for the most part all got placed in the same boat, but it kinda makes sense. Shonen stories have a tendency of sucking when it comes to female characters, some more than others, and Greek stories are far from kind to women given the time period they originate from. But even still, Athena was a goddess whose depictions vary so tremendously at times that it kinda just works. Now, we highlighted Mina to be this for her major assistance to Kirishima as Heracles, which came to fruition as it was her vial of the sedative that Kirishima used while declaring that her chivalrous spirit was in good hands. Now, Roman Athena was kinda insane, so we pinned her to Toga as well, but at this point I might just argue something else entirely. Transformation and or shapeshifting is something of a commonality throughout Greek mythology. People are made to be animals and monsters alike at the behest of the gods. However, one particular figure of significance was especially known for the ability to change herself, the Titan known as Metis. Now, mind you, the basis for our findings at large happen to lie with the Gigantomachy, war of god versus giant, as opposed to what was previously the Titanomachy, god versus titan. But even still, in later traditions, giants were sometimes confused with titans, who also happened to be the children of Gaia. Metis was known to be rather cunning and quite the trickster, and although she didn't play any notable role in the Gigantomachy, Metis was the mother of someone that did, the aforementioned Athena, which made Zeus and Metis lovers, albeit one he feared to lay with for one reason or another, which I'd attribute to Toga loving Deku, while he is otherwise very freaked out by her. But you know what, right now, Toga is the one member of the League of Villains absent from the current battle. And this is because following the death of Twice, she began to question the line between heroes and villains, something she sought to ask of two characters she loves, Uraraka and Deku. In receiving her answer from Uraraka, she couldn't help but cry, but seemed to receive a bit of necessary confirmation as she then began to make her way back to her comrades, with her confusion now apparently being cleared. And this does not bode well for the heroes. During the fight between the League of Villains and the Meta Liberation Army, Toga experienced a quirk awakening, wherein she may now use the quirks of those she loves when donning their visage. Now, this is a major power that the heroes have no idea about. And that's because that entire conflict was covered up to the point of only the likes of Hawks and few others being aware of it. And even then, there is no way that he could have known this particular fact. However, it does certainly tie into what was his utmost concern, the presence of Twice. And Twice, when it came to Greek mythology, we liken to the giants known as Hecatontries, a presence that Hawks opted to kill, as otherwise the heroes would have absolutely no hope of victory. But even then, the quirk of Twice was something that the Doctor had certainly replicated in the form of the courageous Nomu known as Mocha, which is to say that the villains came prepared. And so with Toga's deep feelings towards Twice to the point of his death shifting her whole perspective and outlook on life, despite the relationship being platonic, I believe it is possible that she possesses some of his blood. Not only for the security of it, but realistically speaking, in terms of the narrative, who else would she use? I mean, we just recently had her specify to Uraraka that the blood has to belong to someone that she loves. She took blood from Uraraka during the Forest Training arc and used it during the My Villain Academia arc. And she took blood from Deku during the Provisional License exam and used it during the Overhaul arc. To our knowledge, there is nobody else that she so deeply loves. I mean, she likes Sue, but it's really not that deep. She just thinks that she's cute. And although she cut her tongue once, that wasn't enough blood for her to save for later. And so at that, the only reasonable deduction left to be made would be that she'll be using the blood of Twice, and using it to either aid and or save the villains currently on the scene. Because although she's an expert acrobat, without this ability, her contributions to such a fight wouldn't even be worthy of taking note of. And if there's any hope of Makia getting out of here, it'll take the might of an entire army for sure. Now, unfortunately, even if Toga does do such a thing, it won't be necessarily as destructive as it would have been if Twice himself were here. The fact of the matter being that for as overpowered as the double quirk may be, when it comes to replicating others, it is quite complicated, as they're effectively sentient clones of the person they happen to be a replica of. And to do that in the first place requires detailed measurements of that person's body. And so in turning into Twice, Toga could in theory then turn into an army of herself, which is kinda trippy, but she'd at the very least know of her own measurements. Then again, if she's obsessive enough, maybe she knows Uraraka or Deku's measurements as well? Now, I highly doubt that, as Horikoshi, as we've seen thus far, tends to avoid the utmost extremes of any given threat or presence, as made evident by the lack of an All Might Prime, the death of Twice, the incomplete nature of both the high-end Nomu and Shigaraki, amongst other things. The best we can do is think of the craziest thing possible, dial it back to about, 75%, and there we have it. But yeah, right now, if the whole compressed thing doesn't bode well, then Toga's looking like the villain's only hope of escape. But in regards to the hope of restoring Zeus, we have Hermes and Pan. To begin with, Hermes we believe to be visually represented by Ida, while being contextually represented by Hawks as a god who could do it all. Now, Hawks has certainly played his part throughout the war, and in the beginning, acted as the one to deliver the message of impending bloodshed to Endeavor. And funny enough, the primary job of Hermes was to be the messenger of the gods, as well as the deliverer of the dead to Hades. And with that, we may then attribute Endeavor to be a representation of Hades, god of the underworld. Now, in pop culture, Hades may often be associated with fire and such, when in proper mythology, the only particularly fiery aspect of the underworld would be that of Phlegethon, or Pyrophlegethon, the river of fire, which was but one of 5 rivers and happened to be the most difficult to pronounce. Another thing pop culture tends to do with Hades is depict him as a villainous figure, when in reality, he wasn't any more terrible than any of the other gods. The fact of the matter is, people are always dying. There is always some sort of conflict out there in the world, and so he very much had his hands full at all times. The voices of the dead, however, would at times get to him, and so he'd often go mad and was rather unkind and merciless. But this was only towards those of his charge. Their conditions were awful, and Hades feared such chaos breaching into the worlds of both mortal and god, so he was ever diligent. And you know, with the working relationship between Hermes and Hades, it makes sense why Endeavor is the favorite hero of Hawks and is so admired by him. Furthermore, to the masses, like Hades, Endeavor is a hero. He detains those who would do harm to others, while he himself does harm onto those of his realm. Ergo, the abuse Endeavor's many children were made to suffer. But it gets a whole lot worse. Hades, unlike the only god to clearly supersede his power, Zeus, who we liken to be any user of One for All, in this case being All Might, was a man faithful to his spouse Persephone alone. However, this is once again Greek mythology, and so this is not some beautiful love story, as he became obsessed with her and decided he wanted her to be his wife. And so, as opposed to receiving Persephone's consent, in fear that the goddess that loved flowers and life wouldn't want to live in the underworld with him, he opted to kidnap her and effectively imprison her in the underworld with him. Now, to liken this to Endeavor, rather than really caring for Ray, he sought her ice quirk. And so, being the well-known and ever-wealthy number 2 hero, he approached her family with a quirk marriage, what is, for all intents and purposes, an arranged marriage. And with Endeavor's growing derangement, Ray would begin to feel like more and more of a prisoner in her own home. And interestingly enough, with her now being away from it all, Endeavor sends her her favorite flowers daily. Oh, and by the way, Hades is Persephone's uncle. Yikes. But after procuring himself a captive wife, Hades would go on to have 3 children, Melinoe, Macaria, and Zagreus. 3 children that you've probably never heard of, as they weren't really of any significance, which is kinda just how it goes when you're a god of the underworld and not Hades himself. But even still, this is pretty crazy when you think of Endeavor, as in pursuit of the ideal quirk combination, he had 3 failures. Now, Melinoe and Macaria were both girls, which in relation to Endeavor would attribute them to having the quirks of their mother as opposed to having his, both of which would go on to be no names, as both would not become heroes. But Zagreus was a bit different. Now, this was a male god of somewhat conflicting origins, as Aeschylus, a real-world man regarded as the father of theatrical tragedy, would at times portray Zagreus to be the son of Hades, or even Hades himself. However, in the earliest mention of the god, he was aligned with Gaia, and referred to as the highest god of the underworld. And at that, Zagreus would have to be Dabi. As Toya, Dabi was the first son of Endeavor, who was initially trained to follow down the same path as his father, leading to what would later be an identity crisis, along with the strung out conflictions of his identity throughout the story's narrative. And for a time, I suppose he was the highest god of the underworld, as his flames were denoted to be superior to that of Endeavor. However, as Dabi, that alignment with Gaia, who we presented to be none other than the nefarious Doctor as the creator of the Nomu, makes a whole lot of sense. As a villain, that is clearly the case, But on a more intimate level, Dabi did serve as the one to let Hood off of his leash after having been requested by the doctor particularly. Now at this point, you may be wondering why there are only 3 children. What about our boy Shoto? Well, Shoto was different, as he himself would be more so amongst the gods proper, having overcome the strife of his once abusive household, now following his own heroic path. Unfortunately, however, I can't exactly pinpoint a god he would accurately represent. In considering the 12 Olympians, I suppose Poseidon would be my knee-jerk conclusion, but once again there is no substance to such a claim. But now moving on from the underworld and such, we have Pan, god of the woods and plains, that resembled a cross between a goat and a man, which we concluded was to be airy. Now Pan, due to his ugliness, was shunned and avoided by the gods, but thanks to his mastery of the pan flute, would later come to be accepted and adored by them, something we believed would represent Ares' impending quirk mastery, as before then, it would be dangerous to have her around without a Racerhead to oversee her. And as such, she has properly displayed her capabilities by restoring Muriel's quirk. And we also assume that she would be vital to Deku's recovery, just as Pan was to that of Zeus. But that has yet to come to fruition, as the war is currently still on. However, we did also mention that the societal ramifications of this war would be costly and would change the landscape of the story forever. And it is now clear that this will be the case with Dabi's public address to the masses, amongst other happenings. The Gigantomachy was described to be the most important struggle of divinity in all of Greek mythology, as attested by its ever-frequent depiction across Greek artwork. For the Greeks, this war represented the triumph of order and rationalism over chaos, discord, and excessive violence. And for 5th and 6th century Greeks, it was more specifically a representation of civilization over barbarism. But unfortunately, the now unsettled masses of My Hero Academia may have become disillusioned by their protectorate, inversely now shattering such beliefs. And that's just the way things are trending to go. But moving forward, I'd like to talk a bit about Bakugo. And again, because we were honed in on the events of the Gigantomachy in particular, I didn't go to the trouble of assigning a divine counterpart to each and every character, but since we're here anyways, let us for a moment talk about Bakugo, since he's finally been getting some epic moments with this conflict. So, being the self-proclaimed Great Explosion Murder God, Bakugo is certainly Ares, god of war. Now, Ares wasn't mentioned to have done anything especially crazy during the war against the gods, which is why he wasn't mentioned before, but he was present. And to be fair, this was a god of little popularity, with very few shrines or temples dedicated to him, but even still, he was one of the 12 Olympians. The thing is though, for as powerful as the guy said to be, his character was just downright unlikable. He was a major bully and had terrible anger issues. But even then, in war, he favored those of significant courage on the battlefield. And so despite his lack of popularity, his presence was very important. And with this one, I don't think I even need to do a translation to the character, because it genuinely feels like I just straight up described Bakugo. But with all that being said, that pretty much wraps up everything I wanted to convey to you all. Lots of information in this long conversation, but really and truly, this is that sort of effort and creativity you won't find anywhere else when it comes to this stuff. And we do so almost daily. So if you would, go ahead and subscribe to Plot Armor if you haven't already. And let's open up the discussion in the comments. You guys always make our day down there, so thank you so much for the kind words. And if you'd like to support the channel even more, please consider heading on over to our Patreon, which is linked in the description. And as I always say, when it comes to bringing you some of the best My Hero Academia content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I am Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.